Welcome to the NIHR Dementia Researcher podcast, brought to you by dementiaresearcher.nihr.ac.uk in association with Alzheimer's Research UK and Alzheimer's Society, supporting early career dementia researchers across the world.
Hello and welcome to the Methods Matter podcast from Dementia Researcher and the National Centre for Research Methods, the show that tries to make sense of research methods to help me and you understand them. In this series, we will be looking at 5 different research methods, with a resident method expert and a dementia researcher that has put the method into practice. And today, it's all about oral histories and storytelling. But before we get to that, let me introduce myself. I'm Dr. Donncha Mullin, a psychiatrist and PhD clinical fellow at the University of Edinburgh. Before doing medicine, I qualified as a physiotherapist, and now I combine the physical and mental aspects of ageing by researching a walking speed-based pre-dementia syndrome called motoric cognitive risk. To put it simply, it's a syndrome combining slow walking speed and self-reported memory or thinking problems in older people without dementia. I took on the mission of hosting this second season because I'm not a qualitative researcher, but I'd like to work out which of these methods I could use to improve my work. Undeterred by her experience in the first season, I'm delighted to welcome our now resident expert on all things research methods, Dr. Kahryn Hughes from the University of Leeds. Kahryn is Director of the Timescapes Archive, Editor-in-Chief of Sociological Research Online, Convenor of the MA Qualitative Research Methods, and a Senior Fellow for the National Centre for Research Methods. Hello, Kahryn. How are you?
I'm really good. Thanks so much, Donncha. How's it going?
It's going well. I have a little bit of a dry mouth, but it's going well. Kahryn, when the last season was recorded, you'd just taken up scuba diving. Have you managed to get in the water lately?
I haven't done any more scuba diving. It's just really scary, and I'd have to do myself up for it again. But I have started wild water swimming, which basically means going into the sea when it's really cold during the winter in your swimming costume and splashing about a bit.
Wonderful. Are there any places close by to where you work or where you stay?
Yeah, I'm on the coast in North Wales, so I've got the whole of the North Wales coastline. It's absolutely gorgeous.
That sounds amazing. Moving on, our jobbing researcher for today is Dr. Katja Sion, postdoctoral researcher and linking pin from Maastricht University in the Netherlands. Katja's research looks at the quality of residential elderly care from the resident's perspective, and she describes herself as incredibly impatient and curious, 2 attributes which she has found to be useful skills within academia. Hello, Katja. Welcome to the show.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me today.
We're delighted to have you here. Katja, so before we start, I must ask, your job title said you're a linking pin. I need to know more about this. Also, I spotted you're a new mum, which I can relate to as a new dad, so maybe we can talk about sleepless nights and compare notes on how to cope.
Well, to first zoom into your last question, I think if I get into motherhood, we may be talking about that the whole podcast. So I won't be doing that today. And then to actually get back to the linking pin, I'm actually very proud of this position because where I work at the university, in our department, we've established a living lab in aging and long-term care, one of the first, I think, worldwide even. And it's actually a collaboration between 4 universities, applied universities, vocational institutes, and 9 long-term care organizations in which we collaborate and work together to combine practice and research more closely. And as a linking pin, I'm actually appointed 1 day a week to one of these long-term care organizations to really get to know the lay of the land, to see if there's links, to make sure that the research that we're performing also actually suits what practice is in need of, instead of just doing desk research. So it's really, it really makes the job a lot of fun.
That sounds fascinating. And do you imagine once COVID restrictions lift further that you'll be traveling a lot between the different institutions?
Yeah, the idea is that I really get to know first the organization that I am appointed to, that I get to know that very well. And then also, of course, that I learn from the other organizations. So we can also really disseminate our knowledge. And to a certain extent, we are doing that. We also did that during COVID time.
I'm sure, I bet. Okay, so down to business. What do I know? So we begin each podcast with me giving a summary of what I understand to be the method we're exploring, which, of course, today is oral histories and storytelling. When I first considered what oral histories and storytelling methods were about, I thought, this is going to be easy because what it means is right there in the title. But I suspect I'm going to get caught out by this. So let's start by saying, once upon a time, like every good story should. Here goes. My best guess at what this method involves is listening and capturing people's stories, thinking about their life, childhood, memories, with a focus on preserving the story maybe through audio or video recording, maybe more with a view that this will be helpful to researchers in future generations. For example, I can imagine in 10, 20, 100 years' time how interesting a recording from the last 2 years of people's experience of going through the COVID pandemic would be. Kahryn, put the record straight and introduce the method for us.
So these methods, they emerge at a time when in social science we're becoming more interested not only in describing these large-scale social processes and social change, but we're also interested in how we might be able to observe these changes through what people are doing and thinking. So to research that, we begin to develop biographical methods. So there's a couple of turns, if you like, that have been described as happening. So one is the biographical turn in social sciences research, where researchers turn to look at biography rather than at larger scale processes. And then also a narrative turn, because obviously what we're asking people to do is tell me about your lives. And therefore we're trying to elicit these longer term narratives, or narratives that cover a longer period in people's lives, which brings in a host of new methodological questions that need to be addressing. Now, we've got oral history method and storytelling methods in the one podcast, but actually they're two different methodologies. And so I'm going to deal with each, but then I'm going to clarify the links between them. So oral history methods, it's a way of asking questions, is as a means of recording an oral testimony, like a living testimony. And by that, I mean people describing periods in their lives or describing their whole lives, both as in terms of an individual, obviously from their own perspectives, but the oral history itself becomes a process of encouraging someone to describe a period of history. So they're about individual and collective histories. And what's really lovely about oral histories is that they are sort of products. So they're not only just ways of engaging, but what you produce is an oral history, and maybe an archive or a cache or a collection of oral histories, oral testimonies, so that they can stand as a matter of history for other people into the future. And I think, interesting, I'm going to be keen to get Katya's take a little bit later. For our discussion, oral history means relying on people's memories and recollection. So the other thing, obviously, for me, I'm really keen on methods of qualitative secondary analysis. Oral histories are meant to be reused. So they become historical artefacts that can be examined in the future. And that's different to like interviews that are usually considered to be only to be used by the originating research team, but obviously in qualitative secondary analysis there's a big push. No, don't just think in those ways. So storytelling is slightly different. A lot of human history is told through story, and in actual fact has been stored through stories, through narratives. And we know cross-culturally that there continue to be, really strong storytelling traditions that combine communities and nations that tell and preserve their histories and heritage. So, that's storytelling. And storytelling techniques can be similar to oral histories. They're narratives that have been built up using bits of people's life through skillful questioning. But normally in storytelling in research, what we're asking is people to focus on a particular events. So, for example, you know, with newly married couples, or you say, well, tell me the story of how you met, you know, so that's sort of very focused tale of a particular set of events or whatever. So the commonalities, oral histories are a form of story, inevitably. They've been elicited from the participant in order to produce this narrative thread, a sort of connective narrative that pulls together the bits of their lives as they're lived over time. They're usually a theme to those histories, so they connect to methods like life histories, so life history interviews, you know, use those similar sorts of techniques. And that storytelling can be used to explore, you know, like particular points along someone's life history, or can be used to combine events in ways that produce new oral histories.
Fascinating, Kahryn. Thank you so much for that amazing and informative yet succinct intro. I had one quick question, and there may not be an easy answer. Is there a rule of thumb, say, on when an oral history interview you've recorded, when that becomes historical enough to actually use in your research? You know, as a PhD student, can you interview people and then use that as oral history, or does there need to be a certain amount of time between the data collection and?
No, you can treat it as an oral history straight off the bat. I think the challenge for the researcher is to engage precisely with that question of time, or how we might describe it as temporal remove. So how close am I? How imminent am I in the moment of that history's production? Or how remote am I from that? And what is the challenge there? So what do I lose from not being part of that same history? But then what might I gain from having that historical distance and the ability to build in historical comparison, you know, from one time to another, if you like.
Okay, I like that a lot. Why, Kahryn, would someone choose this method?
Which one, storytelling or history?
Say storytelling, first of all.
So we might use storytelling in order to get a real sense of how somebody made sense of a particular aspect of their life, and what the relevance of that now is when we're speaking to them. So I'm going to come to dementia, just to say I'm not a dementia researcher. So this is purely speculative, and I'm so keen to hear Katya's take on what I'm going to say. But if we're thinking, are people experiencing dementia as a form of illness, or how are they understanding their experiences of dementia? How do they understand past and future in the context of a dementia diagnosis or progressive dementia over time? And so eliciting a story allows us into that process of sense making, and how people, particularly where there are illness narratives, how they may build up ideas of good and bad times, because often they say, well, that was a phase, and then this was a phase, and then that's a phase. So then what you're also then able to build in analytically are points of comparison within the narrative itself. You know, so why might they say that that was good? Why was that bad? What is it that is problematic here, but what is good there? And that obviously helps us to then begin to think through what services we might want to provide, or where service intervention is most necessary. And often when people are most vulnerable and most in need of support, they're least capable of accessing help. And so stories might be able to show us those sorts of disjunctions between need and provision.
Brilliant, Kahryn. Thank you so much for that coverage of storytelling. Now, you said at the outset that there are two separate topics, even though we're covering them in the one topic. What are the main differences for you, and why might someone use oral histories rather than storytelling?
Oral histories give us a much more comprehensive narrative of people, the longer duration of people's lives, and also give us a sense of the times through which they've lived. And as I said earlier, they're both a form of engagement, but they're also a product of research. You know, we seek to preserve them and reuse them. So oral histories with people with dementia might actually be used in order to serve the interests of the participants, that people may feel the memory is going, and what they would really like to do is to provide a human testimony to, to the world that they have lived in and been part of and helped produce. So an oral history in that respect, in the context of dementia research, might be something that researchers can provide, both for the participant and for their families.
Brilliant. And before we move on to Katja, I had one other question around quest narrative. So I've read a little bit about linear and non-linear storytelling, and some of my favourite movies of a non-linear storytelling approach. But what is a quest narrative?
I had to Google this, so I'd not come across quest narratives myself before. Being a real sort of Tolkien lover, I know what a quest is. But, you know, what the dickens is a quest narrative? These are narratives where you encourage somebody to think about a particularly, maybe a challenging aspect of their life or a goal that they would like to achieve. And what you do is encourage them to, describe why this goal is important, what it is that they would want to do, why do they want to do it. Then you can encourage them to talk about, I think you've got, for me, I think that you've got some options here of engaging alongside people as they go through something, say engaging longitudinally or engaging prospectively. So where you can ask somebody, well, how would you get to that goal? What is it that you might need to do? What might be the difficulties of achieving that? And then maybe either connecting with them throughout the research or connecting retrospectively and saying, well, what actually happened? What were the challenges? What were the differences in expectation? So quest narratives, so this was some of the papers that I've been reading that are particularly useful in illness, because, and I think this, and again, Katja, if you've got some views on this, that would be great. But quest narratives, they put that person at the centre of the quest. So if somebody is experiencing a difficulty, health-related difficulty, the narrative encourages them to focus specifically on their needs and on their abilities in the context of these challenges. And so helps that person and other people to identify, again, which people might help along the way, what might they need to support that quest, how might we get people to achieve those goals. But I also know that, for example, in stroke research, that people who have had a stroke and experience, physical impairments as a consequence of stroke, that sometimes their goal is unreasonable, they're not going to attain that. And that's, so a quest narrative might be really useful to support a longer term negotiation between healthcare providers and patients in order to establish more expectations both for them and their families around what can and can't be achieved. Okay,
brilliant. When you mentioned Tolkien, I kept bringing myself back to Frodo with his ring, getting together his fellowship, who can help him, who can't, where he has to go. So thank you for bringing it to my level.
Yeah, who are these magical people? You know, who are the key movers and shakers in helping this person? But the point about that is it's about that person's needs. It's not about the needs of anybody else. It's that very person-centred approach, which obviously maps on to patient-centred care, narratives and agendas for patient-centred care, where we understand people's health journeys or illness journeys as pathways through different healthcare settings. So quest narrative helps us to see that as well.
Brilliant. When I saw quest narrative, I thought, how is that going to be different to an interview? But I think you've explained it so clearly there that you can really see the differences. Katja, could I bring you into the conversation? Now, I know you use narrative inquiry and perspective triangulation. Are there any differences to what Kahryn described?
Yeah, thanks so much for letting me weigh into this conversation because I've also already learned some new things. And for me, I wasn't aware that there were so many different definitions of different types of narratives. So I hope I'm not going to disappoint Kahryn. I'll start with some of the similarities that I've heard. And especially at the end, I really heard some points. I was like, this is exactly how we approach our narratives as well. And that's mainly, it's not about what the interviewer wants to hear. It's about what the person being interviewed wants to tell, wants to share. And you as an interviewer, you can even argue, should you use that word? But to keep it clear for our listeners, I will use that word. And as an interviewer, you are there to facilitate someone else to tell their story. And you will set a kind of framework in order to make sure that someone doesn't drift off completely. Because we all know if you start one story, half an hour later, you may be talking about something completely different. So that is where the interviewer comes in, but it's really about the respondent, the storyteller's story. And if we then also talk about person-centered care, I think this is what person-centered care is about. It's about the person receiving care. Yet then when we come to dementia, I do think it becomes a bit more complicated because as we know, people with severe dementia, they can have trouble to express themselves verbally. Yet that doesn't mean their stories are less relevant. So that's why we also use this perspective triangulation approach. And we often talk about relationship-centered care instead of person-centered care, in which we actually say it's not just about it's not a one-way street. It's not about the care only for the person who is ill, but there's a whole network of involved stakeholders, and they all have their own needs, expectations, and also experiences. Henceforth, if you really want to get into depth of a story, you need multiple perspectives to shine the light on a story, and then you have a much more complete overview. So I think that's maybe an addition to what has already been said, and maybe a difference to how we approach our narratives.
Sure. And Katya, is it okay with you if I start using the term relationship-centered care in my clinical practice?
Yeah, I am a big favor of it. I believe this is what quality of care is about. There's more people involved, so it's also not fair towards the care professional or the family members to let them, to weigh them out of the equation. You can't only give, you're also part of it, so your needs and expectations should also be considered.
Absolutely. For so long, I felt some discomfort with talking about patient-centered care when the only person I really knew, because I took on the care of someone with fairly advanced dementia, was the carer. And it felt like I was sort of ignoring their needs just with the terminology I was using and as used in the multidisciplinary team and in all the paperwork and in all the patient information leaflets. So I really like that, Katya. Thank you so much for bringing that in. Now, could you tell us a little bit more about your research, Katya? What other methods do you use, for example?
Yeah, so maybe it's good to just paint the scope a little bit. So my research actually in my PhD, I developed a narrative method to assess the quality specifically of nursing home care. So that's for people with dementia, also without, but we'll focus on people with dementia now, who are actually living in a nursing home, and how you could assess quality of care from their perspective, because they used to use questionnaires for that. And we all know if someone says, well, the meals here, I give them a 7, you still have no clue. What does that mean? How do I make it an 8? The average of the ward was a 7, but does that mean one person gave a 1 and all of the others gave an 8? You don't really know that much yet. So that was my task. Try and figure out a way how we can do this and actually get useful information so we can also improve quality for individuals. So we actually also know what we need to improve.
And what parts of that methodological approach suit your research question more than the questionnaire? I can see the problems with the questionnaire, and have those problems been overcome using your approach?
Those problems have been overcome, and we've created new problems for ourselves. So we developed a method, it's called connecting conversations. So that's actually based on this care triad that I was just talking about. You have the resident, the family member, and an involved caregiver of the resident. And their three perspectives, they're central. And we've actually developed a whole theoretical framework around this triad, saying that you have experiences beforehand and certain needs. Then you have the actual experience within your care triad, which is really formed not only by what is done, but also how it has been done, who has been involved. And then afterwards, you have an assessment of this in which you look what happened, how did it happen, did it impact your health status in any way, and also how did it make you feel? So often we tend to go straight towards satisfaction, just are you satisfied, yes or no? But from our framework, we actually have highlighted there's many more components before being able to say if you're satisfied or not.
Amazing. So it seems you've discovered more than 7 out of 10. You've discovered what happened, how, and really importantly, the impact on how it makes each of these people of the triad feel. Fantastic. And when you were talking to each person, each member of the care triad, did you find that their perspectives differed?
I must say we really did actually, and we're really happy about that, because otherwise you could argue if all three are going to tell the same, then don't spend the time on it, because it is time consuming, of course. That's also one of the challenges we have. But what we really see is that quite often a resident will express something and a caregiver will maybe say the exact opposite, whereas both think the other one knows. So it makes very explicit that maybe there's not enough time also for these short conversations to express your needs. And residents also often feel they don't want to whine, they don't want to complain, so they'll keep it to themselves. But maybe a small example will help. So there was a resident that said, I'm so frustrated. They always keep me in bed till I'm one of the last ones that gets taken out of bed in the morning. And I'm in so much pain. I want to get up. Whereas the caregiver told us, we're so happy to share with you that people can get up whenever they want here. And for this resident, we let him sleep in. Well, there's a true mismatch, whereas you think you're providing proper quality of care, and you would never detect this with a questionnaire.
No, and instead have you had a therapeutic conversation? Or were all parties in the conversation at one time, or did you talk to each individually?
So the interviewers are actually independent, even though they are aware of the nursing home setting. So that's very valuable, because they also get a chance to have a peek somewhere else and also learn from these stories of residents and family members and other staff members who they otherwise would have never met.
And does each member of the triad find out the other person's perspective and in that way get a better understanding?
As it's research, in our informed consent, we ask them if it's okay to share the information not anonymously, because usually you would do everything anonymously, of course. But I think at least 75% nowadays, probably even more, are okay with that. And then we can share it with the care team and also within the care triad. But you do want to keep that safe environment.
Sure, that's fantastic. So not only are you improving communication and clarifying what could be a lot of misunderstandings, but you're also training nursing staff to have those really helpful conversations. So now that we have a description of what the method is and an example of how it has been used, let's get into the detail and provide some top tips for anyone who is new to using the method. In this segment, I'm going to ask some quick, straightforward questions to both guests on how to put method into practice. Kahryn, the first ones are for you. Question 1. How should someone prepare?
And I'm going to come back to what Katya said, is that I think it's better to ask, how can we enable somebody else to tell their story? So researchers will always be thematising a story. They will be structuring it in some way. And so one of the decisions that you have to make in preparing for this sort of research is decide on how specific you want to go or how broad. And both of those approaches have their own distinctive challenges. So when it's very specific, it can be quite constraining in shaping the stories that people give you. And then on the other hand, being very wide, it might be unstructured and sometimes less of a story, more of a stream of consciousness. So it's those sorts of judgments.
Brilliant. Question 2. Can anyone participate, or do you need to be selective in choosing people? For example, are shy people harder to work with, say?
Yeah, I think stories are great because we all storify our everyday lives anyway. So stories are actually, we are narrative beings, you know. I mean, this is, you know, this is one of the really interesting things, because people keep treating methods as tools, as if they're sort of like a Lego kit. And, you know, we've created the pieces and then we've put it together. And somehow it sits outside of you know, us as people and as human beings, when in actual fact research methods are very reflective, particularly qualitative ones, are very reflective of who we are as people. So for example, you know, you'll get up in the morning and you'll say to someone, I had a really bad night's sleep, and I had a bad night's sleep because of such and such, and you might tell them the story of your night's sleep. Or it might be a bigger one. You know, you tell them the story of your education or of your relationship or of your illness or whatever. But we constantly tell each other stories. So we know that stories need a beginning, a middle and an end. We know that, you know, they provide descriptions and explanations. And I think one of the things that it's useful to keep in mind as a researcher is to understand the narratives that people produce in research as processes of theorising. That actually that's, you know, that our participants are developing explanations for us and are drawing on a whole range of different disciplinary knowledge. So I may say, well, I had a bad night's sleep because I had too much coffee. But that just simple statement that we all say to each other is predicated on this idea that I understand the impacts of caffeine on my system, and that I understand the relationship between substances and sleep quality and brain activity and so on and so forth. I'm drawing on quite specific disciplinary knowledge in formulating that story about my night's sleep. So I think whether people are shy or not, it's less about that. It's about how we, again, coming back to this point before, how we're going to be able to support people in providing the stories that they want to tell. So it doesn't really require speaking sometimes. So for some people, they might not be able to speak. But so we might be using, you know, physical materials, plasticine even, or something like that. We could use, or Lego. You could use Lego to build a story or build stages, or life history maps, or you know, these sorts, all sorts of things. But things like poems, songs, films, these are all forms of storifying that we can encourage people to do. So these sorts of approaches are a great way to see how people understand the conventions of storytelling and what they will put forward as moments of drama. So that's I'm now shifting us towards analysis here, rather than, you know, the bit about how do we get people to participate. But that's something that's good to bear in mind. I think, sorry, Donncha, I just did want to say, what doesn't seem to be happening is research that collects the stories people have already written or recorded. So people constantly write short stories, novels, autobiographies. There are all lots of informal autobiographical materials in most people's houses. They've recorded something about their lives already. So I think that's quite a rich source to draw on when perhaps people don't have the words anymore.
Sure. And could you envisage a time maybe where people's Facebook channels or their other social media channels will be really rich sources of their life story?
Yeah, well, I think for the last 10 years, there have been various software programs that diarise people's social media participation. So drawing across all of their social media platforms and engagement in order to link across how they might have used Snapchat, Instagram, Twitter and Facebook around particular events such as a birthday or something, and how that might have been represented. Because that is one of the concerns of everything going digital, is that all of those incidental written things, love letters, for example, which are just either texts or even emojis now, that those sort of get lost and obscured through digital participation.
Fantastic. So I've been thinking about how you actually practically analyze the information that you collect, but I think you've sort of said that it depends on what way you collect it, so it's not always language. And I'm still struggling with how would you practically analyze if information was collected, such as using, say, plasticine models or even art. Now, this is showing my ignorance of art and how to interpret art. But can you give us an insight how you might do it if it's not language?
With things like plasticine, you might take photos of them. So even though the objects may disappear, you've nevertheless got a record. You might have video recorded the process of making. To see if there was any conversation, what sorts of exchanges there were. With art and pictures, you can ask children or older people to explain what they mean, or why they drew it in that way, why the representation takes on that form. And so you have both, again, a form of engagement which is explanatory and articulates particular ideas and meanings that person holds. So those sorts of outputs are hugely distinctive, but unique to that individual, but nevertheless contribute to broader storytelling tropes or mechanisms, really, or means of telling or showing stories.
Okay, and so there's almost two types of information that I have in mind collected, the story itself, and then maybe information about the story and what was going through the person's mind during that process. Is there a third layer? Can you combine those pieces of information with other information to further triangulate or to further inform your research?
Yeah, so I'm going to step back here. I think that a really common pitfall in research generally is that people seem to feel that it's only in fieldwork that data are generated or evidence is generated. And that's hugely problematic. It's problematic for the language of scholarship, for example, or disciplinary excellence and expertise. We've done a huge amount of learning and analysis already before we even get to the research encounter. So fieldwork isn't the only crucible in which research happens. So the whole busy dynamic of getting the research going, finding your way through existing evidence and scholarship, finding your way to those participants through all of the different relationships, and Katya's research is an absolute exemplar in this respect, and different settings. All of that is your research data. It's all of that is different forms of evidence. And so your job as a researcher is to make sense of how you can use all this evidence to speak to your research question.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned how Katya's work is an excellent exemplar of this. And Katya, on to you. Are you ready for some quick fire questions? Did people find it hard to tell their stories when you were working with them?
Well, to be honest, I really had the feeling that most people loved it. They were happy to get time to share their stories, to tell what they wanted to tell, and the personal attention that they actually got for a moment. So it's been, it's been a treat for them as soon as everything was in place, of course. And I think what also helps is we use this method in our conversations called Appreciative Inquiry, in which we address the conversation from a positive perspective. So Appreciative Inquiry says you should look at what is going well and how can we do more of this, instead of focusing on the negative, which often, when it comes to quality assessment, people are asking themselves, what isn't going well? How can we fix this? Whereas you can also look what is going well and how can we do more of this? Henceforth, you will be doing less of the things that aren't good.
Sure. Sure, I love that idea. I'm gonna try and apply that to all areas of my life. Did you mentioned about there? You said that they really enjoyed the process once things were in place. Now, what sort of things did you need to get in place to support people to share their stories?
I think it's important in general to have a safe environment. So that's, for example, why we made the decision to have the respondents to interview them separately, not together, because a resident may not be comfortable telling what he or she really thinks if his caregiver is there. And I think an additional factor is it still is research. So, for example, when we do this on a ward, we don't ask all residents, but we have to do randomization to get a representable sample size. And then you need to see if these people that are the first in your randomization list want to participate, and if their family wants to participate, and the caregiver, and there's informed consent. So it's still, I mean, I think it's with any research, but it is still research. So you need to put a lot in place. And then there's still the external interviewer that has to be available to perform these conversations. And it's also, at the moment, I think it's the same in the UK as here. There's quite some staff shortages. So any hour that they cannot take care of their own residents is, of course, a loss. Yet they also see the benefit of performing these conversations. So these are some of the challenges we've had to overcome.
And you mentioned it in the challenges, just the research, the very nature of it. Did you find that you could be flexible with the actual location where you did the method gathering? And could you go outside, for example, if it was a nice sunny day, or was that bound by confidentiality or other protocol reasons?
I think it should be possible. However, you do have the challenges of residents, especially in the Netherlands, at least in dementia wards, you can't always just take a resident out of the ward. And family members, we do often also provide them the opportunity to have the conversation by phone, for example, especially in these COVID times. So that's been helpful. And caregivers, well, usually they're so busy, they'd rather just have it, have a quick conversation in their work spot than to really take the time for it, unfortunately. But
yeah, the time pressures are shared with the UK here and Ireland, I think. Did you find in general that one discussion was enough, or did you tend to go back to the same people multiple times?
Surprisingly, we've seen that on average our conversations only take 20 minutes, which is much shorter than you'd expect when you're talking about narratives. Yet I think because of the framework, and we do have quite a clear research question, we want to know how they experience the quality of care. That doesn't mean there's no space for someone's life history. However, this isn't our focus. So you can get to the core quite quickly. And we see in our analysis that, of course, sometimes you'd like to know a bit more, you'd like to go deeper, but you can do that when you give the stories back for quality improvement initiatives. You don't need to do that within your data collection, which makes it quite usable in practice.
Okay, thank you. Last question for you, Katja. What might you do with the information or stories once this study is finished?
Well, I think very important actually in our whole study is that the main objective is maybe not even to collect the stories for research, but it is to collect the stories for quality improvement initiatives. And I think that's also linked to the view of our living lab. We do our research in order to help practice. So what we do is we discuss with the world where we've performed the conversations how they would like to get the data back. We're actually experimenting with text analysis, like text mining, to actually analyze these transcripts on a different level. And we've also developed a matrix to plot these triangular interviews on in a graph in which you actually can see to which extent do the perspectives agree with each other or not, and to which extent are they positive or negative. And these are forms of analysis that we give back to the wards, and they can use this with the stories themselves to decide what do we want to work on, what are we proud of, what would we maybe like to improve. And I think that makes it very, very valuable.
Okay, so that's been a fantastic conversation. It's not over, but I just wanted to recap on what we've learned so far. A couple of points. One important one being that oral histories and storytelling are distinct and different methods. It's not one method. They're importantly different. Another very important one for me was that Katya's team use relationship-centered care, and they focus on a care triad. And this has benefits for improving communication across the team. And a third learning point for me was this term appreciative inquiry, and it's something that I'm going to try and carry on through in all areas that I can apply it. So in this final part of the show, we're going to discuss common pitfalls, challenges, and how to avoid them, which, when it comes to this research method, I can imagine that there might be a few. Katya, tell us, what challenges did you come across in delivering your research, and what might you do differently?
A very good question, because this is also how other researchers can learn and maybe not make the same mistakes. I think part of this I have already addressed. For example, you need to make sure that you have a good sample size, because otherwise your results probably are biased over the board. And another thing that I haven't addressed yet is that it's also very important with my research. For example, there are a lot of stakeholders involved, and still actually are. That already starts within the care triad. Each participant has different needs. The nursing home has different needs. In the Netherlands, you're required to assess quality of care from the resident's perspective. So there's also the accountability that you need to account for. And henceforth, I think it's very important to involve all your stakeholders throughout your research, but also dare to not incorporate all their feedback, because it's impossible. So you need to make sure you know what everyone wants, and then you need to also decide on which path you're going to take and stick to that, because otherwise you're going to have a lot of pitfalls along the way. So, for example, we decided to really stick to the resident perspective and to just stay close to the triad. So if you would look from an organizational perspective, you would never use stories, because stories are such rich data, you would never be able to get to that aim. So therefore, I think it's important to know what all your stakeholders want and explain to them the choices you've made, but you need to also dare to not follow everyone's needs, because then you'll be missing opportunities as well.
Wonderful. Kahryn, Katya mentioned a couple of pitfalls there, such as not sticking with the resident's perspective or not staying close to the triad. Are there other common pitfalls that you've seen, and if so, how do you avoid them?
So there are some more general methodological ones. So analytically, when we're either dealing with oral histories or storytelling, we're focused on generating linear narratives. And it's potentially problematic because it might build in causality. So where the relationships between different dimensions of experience might not be causal, but express something quite different. So how people may link some aspects of their lives with others, we may treat them problematically as researchers. I think also with structuring people's accounts in particular ways, we always will. We're always asking questions. They know that we want to research them. We've got particular research aims. That's why we give them information sheets. We tell them we need informed consent, so we have to tell them what we're doing. So my preference, however, is trying to keep things as wide as possible, because it can be a bit of an echo chamber where our expectations as researchers might overwhelm our participants' own narratives. But I do think, we're treating two very different methodologies here. So one, the oral history tradition is to keep as wide as you possibly can. You want to cast your net wide because you want to gather as much information about the world in which this person was living through. And for that, you need a lot of time. And so there are some pragmatic considerations there, which is particularly in the context of dementia, is less one around memory, because they may well have very good memories about early parts of their lives, but about stamina and endurance, if we're asking them to talk for quite a long time. And then obviously with storytelling, the inclination is against being too wide and too broad, because what we want to do is people to produce a connected narrative and set of explanations about a given set of events. So, so I think it's worthwhile at this point teasing out those differences between those two methodological approaches and the different challenges that might apply to each of them.
Okay. Now, that might be something that in the final segment you might be able to pick apart, Kahryn, because I think for time we're running on to the final 1 minute segment where you tell our listeners what they should go away and read to further their knowledge on this method.
Again, two methods. The Oral History website, the Oral History Society, have a website, and the links can be shared. And that's an absolute brilliant resource for anyone to dip into. They also run some fee-paying courses on the method, on oral history methods. Anything by Joanna Bornett, who is an oral historian, and her work is absolutely fantastic on talking through the implications of oral history. The National Centre for Research Methods have a host of research methods resources that are free to use on oral histories, and they too run methods training programmes, so it's good to check there. And also have a look at the work of Rachel Thompson. She's written loads, and she's done stuff about she's done blog podcasts as well, various things about oral histories and storytelling. In terms of storytelling specifically and how we collectively build stories, I think that the perfect starting point is Ken Plummer's Documents of Life. And he's got a website that is absolutely dripping with resources. It's very, very rich resource in and of itself, in which he tells his own stories. So it's a lovely place to start.
Fantastic. Folks, this has been a brilliant first episode of our second season. I've learned so much, it's made me want to run out into the street with my phone on record and start capturing these stories. It's been so fascinating. I hope you've both enjoyed it. I'm sure listeners have too. If listeners want to know more about oral histories and storytelling methodology and narrative inquiry and perspective triangulation, or more about the National Centre for Research Methods, Dementia Research, and our guests today, you will find all the links in the show notes. And remember, if you found this useful and learned some stuff, then please share this podcast with your friends, and or leave a review online and subscribe to the Dementia Researcher podcast. That is all we have time for today. I would like to say a huge thank you to our guests. We've had the wonderfully helpful Dr. Katja Sion sharing her experiences, and in Expert Corner, the incredible Dr. Kahryn Hughes. Thank you both. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you. I've had a great time. It's been so lovely and really, really informative to hear about Katja's research. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a real honour to be here today, so it was really nice to meet you.
The honour is all mine. I'm going to end in the way that every good story should, and we all lived happily ever after.
Brought to you by dementiaresearcher.nihr.ac.uk in association with Alzheimer's Research UK and Alzheimer's Society, supporting early career dementia researchers across the world.